Welcome to month 2 of the Quilty Chicks Quilt Along. Last month there was a lot to do. We were cutting out all our fabric, making our basic body parts, but from here on out it's all downhill. This month we're just making this cute chicken 2 with this sawtooth wreath interior block. The one thing that is going to be tricky about this is that we'll have to cut our chicken fabric very carefully in order to get the pieces that we need out of our scraps from cutting the body parts. So as you're cutting the body parts, be really careful just to like barely trim off just a little bit to straighten up the edge, cut out your body parts, and then save all of the scraps. I'm going to demonstrate how to best cut out the pieces that you'll need for the sawtooth wreath block. When you're cutting, but you can just refer to your pattern, and if this line isn't exactly straight, you can straighten it up just a little bit, just enough to get it straight there. Then you're going to cut 2 strips that are 1 7/8 inch long. I have my fabric folded here to make sure it comes out straight. I'll make sure that it's lined up down there and cut. Then you'll cut 2 strips that are 1 1/2 inches wide. So there's just a little bit left over. There should be another little scrap from cutting out your body parts also. So I'm going to cut out all of my pieces that I'm going to want all of the length. So I'm going to line these up, move those out of the way, and I'll just barely cut off that selvage, and then just cut out all my squares. And look, we even have a little bit left over. Keep this just in case there's issues with the 1 1/2 inch pieces. You could cut a few 1 1/2 inch pieces out of this. Now I'm going to take my 1 1/2 inch strips. With the 2 strips stacked on top of each other, I'm going to trim off my selvages and then cut out the larger units, and then I'll cut my squares. So there is a little bit of wiggle room for if you make mistakes, you can cut out some more pieces out of this. Next, I'm going to cut out my quilt block fabric. I have a piece of fabric that's about 20 inches long. I folded it in half and lined up the folded edge with my marks on my ruler so that I make sure it comes out nice and straight when I cut. I'm going to trim off the edge, and then I'm going to cut 2 strips the width of the different squares that I need. So I'll have one width at 1 1/2 inches and the other width at 1 7/8 inches. And then I'll proceed to cut the squares that I need. I'm even going to fold this in half so that I can cut 4 squares at once. And then we'll cut our other squares, folding it in half again, so I'm cutting 4 squares at once. 4 is about as many layers of fabric as I want to cut at a time. Any more than that, I find that the rotary cutter doesn't cut as well, or it kind of pushes and pulls at the fabric. All right, a little bit left. We are good to go. You are going to want to cut these chicken squares in half Making a square in a square unit. So the first step is to sew a triangle on either side of your square. When you're lining them up, you'll want to put them right sides together. You'll want the point of the triangle to be in the middle of the square, and for these little triangles off on either side to be even. And then you can pin this if you want. It's pretty small, so I think I'll just hold it. And we'll go over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how I sew them together. So I have my triangle lined up in the middle of one of the sides of my squares with the side triangles that poke over the sides as close as I can get it to even. Now I'm going to line up the edge of the square and triangle with my presser foot and do a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. And then we're just going to chain piece these until we've put triangles on all of our squares, well, on one side of them, and then we'll come back and do the other side. Chain piecing helps speed up the process enormously. It would be even faster if I had pre-put these all on, but here we are. When you put your fabric pieces under the presser foot, you'll notice that the needle doesn't line up right here at the intersection of the fabrics. It's over a little bit to the side. That is fine. That is how it should be. So one thing, if you're having a hard time with 1/4 inch seams, the biggest game changer for me was when I got a 1/4 inch foot, and specifically a 1/4 inch foot with a little guard here. There's a little piece of metal on the side that means that my pieces can't scooch over here and have too large of a seam. All of a sudden I was like, how can people be so precise? It's like impossible to get perfect points. And then like overnight, my points were lining up so much better and it was so much easier. It's the best $20 I ever spent. And now it's time to sew a triangle on the other side. We're gonna do the same thing, 1/4 inch seam all the way down. All right, I've sewn triangles onto both sides. I'm gonna trim them apart and then go over to the ironing board and press the triangles. All right, I've brought all my little squares over to my ironing board, and the first thing I'm going to do is just set the seams. Just put your iron on top of them for a few seconds. This helps the stitching really integrate into the fabric and will make the seams press open a lot straighter and smoother. So if you have a small iron, this might be the time to get it out. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with on one side and I'll nudge the triangle open with the side of my iron and then just sit on it and press 1, 2, 3, 4 up. Flip it over, iron down, nudge it with the side of my iron, and then hold 1, 2, 3, 4. I find that nudging them helps make sure that seam is all the way open. Now you'll notice it still wants to poke up. That's kind of okay. We're going to be pressing it some more when we add in our other triangles. I have a couple of tricks. One, you can just flip it over when you're done. That'll help hold the triangle open and help those seams lay a little flatter. If you have a clapper, a piece of wood that you can just put on top of your block, that is great, but I don't. So sometimes I'll just take a book, in this case a small book, because this is a small block, and just lay it on top of it, and that holds some of the heat in and really helps the seams to set and the triangles to stay open and flat. Now I'm a press to the side type of person because I like to nest my seams. If you're a press open person, that's fine. You do that. Everybody just needs to do what works best for them. Just keep on stacking those up there. The heavier the book, the better. For my larger blocks, I'll use a much larger book. Or sometimes I'll just keep this here and press another block unit on top of it. So that first block unit is getting double the pressing. And then just keep pressing until you have all of them pressed open. At this point, you're gonna wanna trim off these little corners. You don't have to, but it sure helps. It helps reduce bulk and just helps everything lay flatter. And while you're trimming, you might notice that the triangles weren't lined up perfectly perfect. Some of mine aren't. That's okay. Like in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to make a huge difference. I mean, it might. Like that one's kind of weird. Sometimes it just happens. Like, actually, I might want to redo that one. That one's really off. Okay. So I guess if there's something really off, you can fix it at this point. All right, we're back at the sewing machine and we're going to attach the remaining triangles to the remaining sides. In this case, the seam line really should, if everything's going perfectly, which sometimes it doesn't, and that's okay, should start in this notch and end at this notch. So that's what we're aiming for. That's going to make this open up really nicely and have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. If this is a new technique to you, and if you're making this type of block or working with pieces this small for the first time, we are not going to stress. We're just going to have this be a learning experience. If you want to take a second, you can put your needle down and see if it's in that notch. If it's not, or something seems weird, you can adjust a little bit if you need to. All right, I'm going to cut these apart and go over and press them. All right, I'm over here ready to press. Last time I just like set the seams all at once. Another thing I realized that I do a lot is I'll set the seam with one block and then push, nudge and press. So it's all kind of part of the same movement. Once you're done pressing all of the square and the square units, you're going to trim off all of these little triangles. Now, if this edge and this edge don't line up super perfectly, you can give a little trim to just even it out. Let me see if I find, oh, so like here, for example, this part sticks out farther than this part. From this point to the end is still just about a 1/4 inch, but I'm just going to kind of take off a little bit here, but not cut the corner off, kind of angle it out to the corner a little bit. Now we're going to sew our little squares together. These pieces are so small, it's a little bit crazy. They're small enough that you can just even keep them on the edges of your sewing machine almost. And again, these are so small that there's really no need to pin. Just put them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam down one side. If you're someone who likes finger pressing, these pieces are small enough that you could just give these a really good press with your fingers and sew the next piece onto it without pressing it with an iron, and that should work just fine. But I kind of like pressing them with an iron, so I'm going to go do that really quick and I'll be right back. All right, now we're going to sew these next units together to make a little corner square. Just line straight edges together. If all is well, the top and the bottom will line up, and we'll just sew a 1/4 inch seam down one of the sides. Now, when you are lining these up, if this one happens to be a little bit shorter than this, what I do is I just center it on the other piece. So, I mean, this is pretty good, but if this was smaller, I'd have the same amount of extra fabric on this side as this side, and then it'll be easy to kind of make it work, kind of fudge some seams to make everything come together. But if all of the extra fabric was on one side of the block, or this little block unit, that could make it a little bit harder to fudge the seam and work everything in together. All right, time to cut them apart and press. I like to lay out my block units beside my sewing machine so that I can really make sure, oops, that goes there, that I know where everything goes and that I'm going to be sewing the correct things together. So, and definitely before you start sewing, make sure to double check the placement, especially these are the same, however you rotate it, but make sure that these are, the quilt block fabric is pointing towards the center. All right, let's go sew it together. Now there is a fun way to sew these units together. Now I'm just lining them up. You'll center this square with the other square. If they're not quite even, again, make it so the unevenness is even and around. When I like to put these square and a square units on the top, because as I sew, I can see this X made by this seam and this seam, and I know that if I can cross that X, then my point will be perfect. If I'm on this side of the X, my point will be cut off. If I'm on this side of the X, there'll be a little bit of background fabric and my seam will be a little narrow, but it'll be okay. So let's go. And that X is, I mean, it should just be at the 1/4 inch mark. So everything is good. Now for this, you'll notice I sewed the top 2 together, and now I'm chain piecing the second row, the pieces together, and then I'll do these 3rd row, and I'll show you why. Especially with these small blocks, it makes it super easy and fast to piece. This is called the spider web method, and it can be used to sew quilt block units together, but you can also use it to sew your quilt blocks for your whole top. Like if this was a 12-inch block, you can use the same method to sew all of your quilt blocks together. We've got all of these hooked together, and pretty good. So what I'm going to do is open this up, and if I put it down here, I can double check and make sure that everything's where it should be. And then I will add these pieces onto the other side without cutting them apart. Now I'm going to take these over to the iron. So I've pressed my seams without cutting the rows apart, and we're going to, without cutting them apart, just fold it over, match the seams in between the units, and sew a 1/4 inch seam right down the side. One thing I wanted to say is that I like using a smaller stitch length. I usually sew at a 1.8 because the smaller stitches tend to help keep these seams from pulling apart. I like a 1.8 stitch length. You can try it, see if you like it. So here we are. I'm going to press this, and then we're done. And all right, we're going to set these seams and press the seams to the side. The seams are a little bit bulky, and I really like to get a nice flat press. So what I like to do at this point is to spritz it with just a little water, or hit the steam option on your iron, and we're not going to move back and forth. We're just going to press down. When you add steam and movement to a quilt block as you're pressing, it can distort it. So we're just going to be really careful. That little bit of water and steam is really helping it. And I'm going to put my bigger book on top of it now that we're working with a bigger block, and I'll wait for it to cool all the way off. The next thing you'll do is you'll follow the instructions just like you did for chicken 1, and add the other chicken body pieces to this block. You're going to be using the beak only option and the comb 1 option for this chicken, for chicken 2. Good luck. I can't wait to see all of your chickens. They're so cute. It's going to be so fun to see all of these come together. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.